everybody, happy Christmas and welcome along to a brand new video where of course it's Christmas Eve, so what better than to look at Doctor Who Christmas specials. Sadly there isn't going to be a Christmas special this year of course, and unfortunately it looks like it might be the end of Doctor Who Christmas specials for the foreseeable future at the very least. But it doesn't mean we can't look back to the past and look back at the Christmas specials, and now that we've got a full kind of collection that probably will never change, why not rank them? That seemed a good idea, doesn't it? So, we've had 13 Doctor Who Christmas specials. I must say, I am including the End of Time Parts 1 and Part 2 as one. I know, slightly cheating, but it's one story and half it aired on Christmas Day, so we're going with that. But yes, overall there's been 13 Doctor Who Christmas specials, and I thought what better than to rank them from number 13 to number 1. And guys, keep a lookout for number 1, because I'm pretty sure you guys are going to destroy me in the comments for this. But I have chosen number 1, and yes, it's going to be an interesting experience when you get towards there, I think. But anyway, let's get started and get into the number 13. So yes, coming in last, probably less of a surprise to people than some of my higher choices will be, is The Doctor, The Widow and The Wardrobe, the Series 6 sort of Christmas special from 2011, featuring Matt Smith and not really Amy and Rory, or Karen Gillan and Arthur Darvill. They only turn up for the last 2 minutes, and that already makes this story a bit worse than it is already. But the plot, of course, is a knockoff of Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Narnia, and just isn't very good, I think. I know that sounds very vague, but the plot is kind of boring and bog standard. The child actors I don't think are very good, from what I remember. And it just kind of like, it's a sort of episode you could get away with on Christmas Day, but if that was in a series, it would be like so bad. It really would be just terrible. So unfortunately, that's why it comes right down the bottom of my list, because there's just really nothing good going for it. Yes, I mean, the actual resolution is a bit crazy, where the kid's like sort of basically wishing to be home or something like that, isn't it? And then kind of ends up there. The visuals are not bad, I think. The kind of, yeah, it doesn't look bad visually, but the actual story is just atrocious. But Matt does put in a reasonable performance. I must say, I also think, I remember one of the reasons being for this script, this sort of episode really not being very good, was basically Stephen Moffat did not have enough time to write this episode. Simple as that. He was trying to write a series of Sherlock, trying to finish Series 6 of Doctor Who, I think even thinking about Series 7 of Doctor Who as well. Like, he just did not have enough time. He had to do this in, like, goodness knows how, like, a couple of weeks or something. It was a terribly short amount of time. So it was kind of, it's almost like this was a first draft, I think, of an episode that kind of ended up actually being made rather than being script edited a lot. So, yeah, unfortunately, this comes down right to the bottom. Next up at number 12 is The Next Doctor. So this episode, I don't hate it, and I did initially quite like the idea of this sort of mysterious guy who thinks he's the Doctor, played by David Morrissey, of course, quite a big name actor to get for Doctor Who. And it did kind of, I think at the time, it obviously threw a little bit of mania of, is David Tennant actually leaving? Is this the new Doctor? What's going on here? Obviously it's all a lie, and the title's just Russell being a little bit naughty. It's probably the best way of putting it. So yeah, I kind of like that aspect of it, but I feel like the Cybermen are not very good in this story at all. Like the whole Cyber King idea and everything like that, I just don't think works particularly effectively. It's quite nice to see an episode kind of set in Victorian times on Christmas Day, rather than the very often getting sort of present day time in a Christmas special for Doctor Who. But yes, with this story, of course, David Tennant doesn't have any companions either, so that's kind of a little bit more stretched in that regard. And yeah, so it's not a terrible story, but I think again it's one of those that just doesn't have a lot going for it. But I do think it's kind of got at least that kind of interesting point of who's this guy who claims to be the Doctor, what's going on with that, and also Cybermen in it. Even if the Cybermen and those cyber shade things, I think, were also not the greatest idea, and kind of shows in the fact that they've never come back again since. Now, up next at number 11 is The Return of Dr. Mysterio. Yes, this is Peter Capaldi's third out of 4 Christmas specials, the 2016 Christmas special, coming off the back of a gap year for Doctor Who. And unfortunately for me, it didn't come back with the bang I was maybe hoping it would. I think this is one of those episodes that kind of is very... Some people will love it, some people will hate it, some people will feel very in the middle about it. Like, it's one of those episodes where, because it's about superheroes and there's the whole focus of it is about it almost meant to be a superhero movie style of episode. It's kind of like, if you like superhero movies, then you're going to love it. If you don't like superhero movies, then it's not going to do very much for you apart from being Doctor Who. So and I kind of fall into the latter category there, because I've never been much of a fan of superhero films, Marvel or anything like that. It's just personally never really done too much for me. So when I kind of heard this episode was about superheroes and that kind of whole style, I was like, okay. I'll try and be sort of optimistic about it and not go in thinking too negatively, but I wasn't really expecting to love it, I think is the best way to put it. And ultimately I didn't. I thought it's a fairly kind of straightforward superhero plot with but it's obviously meant to be a knockoff of Superman anyway, and that's kind of the idea behind it to some degree anyway. Of course I love Capaldi as the Doctor, and so he always puts on a good performance, and did in this episode. And those last few scenes at the end when he's sort of remembering River, and things that happened there are quite nice and quite emotive. But apart from that, it does just kind of feel like one of those episodes that's, well, yeah, for me, just is not one I would ever really go back to watch again. It's kind of like, I'll watch it in a rewatch, but it's just not, yeah, for me, got anything particularly going for it. Next up, coming in at number 10, we have The Runaway Bride. Of course, Catherine Tate's debut in Doctor Who, the 2006 Christmas special, so the second one they ever did of the sort of new Who Christmas specials. And this one is, I think, yeah, it's not terrible. Again, it's not one of those sort of really, really bad episodes. I feel like Catherine Tate is maybe a little bit too of a sort of comedic character in this story, rather than being a serious character, which she's sort of more developed into later on. So I feel like for this episode, that it kind of helps and hinders it. Of course, Catherine Tate's quite a big name to have in Doctor Who as well. At the time, getting her for Christmas special would have been quite a big thing. And it's kind of nicely set up from the end of Doomsday, where we have her suddenly turning up in the TARDIS and we're like, what on earth is going on? Like, that tees up the episode quite nicely. And then her sort of being chased around by the Doctor, it feels like, I don't know, it just feels like a really iconic scene to me when the Doctor's chasing her Donna in the taxi with the TARDIS down a motorway. Like, that kind of just feels like one of those iconic moments in Doctor Who for me, even though it's not like a particularly massive moment. Just kind of visually, I feel like it's quite spectacular and quite memorable in that regard. So that kind of sets it off quite nicely. Obviously, I feel like the Rachnos are actually not a bad kind of villain. The idea they've been there since the dawn of time, and that she's escaped and is trying to raise up all her people from underneath the earth and everything like that. So she's going to destroy the world. Yes, it's a bit of a destroy the world plot again, and feels a little bit shoehorning Christmas into things as well, to some degree, rather than it being particularly focused on Christmas. Of course, that's a problem with many of the Christmas specials, is they're trying to shoehorn Christmas elements into it. I feel like with Stephen Moffat, he kind of wrote episodes that focused on kind of Christmas stories more so. When you think about, like, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the A Christmas Carol, the Snowmen story has a lot of kind of elements, obviously snowmen in it, but it's kind of got a lot of elements of kind of Christmassy things in it. And I just feel like, compared to the Russells era, where the episodes do very much feel like a normal story with a Christmas tree or some tinsel in the background, the Stephen Moffat stories are very much tailored around Christmas and the idea of Christmas. And so I think, that's just kind of a difference. I mean, it works in some places and doesn't work in other places. And with an episode like Runaway Bride, it kind of falls somewhere in the middle, I think, in terms of it works reasonably well, but isn't a kind of massively inspiring, spectacular story, though I do think that Donna pulls off a good performance. It also shows the darker side of the Doctor, of course, as well, when he essentially just kills all the Rachnos and lets them all die. I think that's quite interesting, and her sort of saying how he needs somebody to stop him essentially, which I think is kind of, yes, obviously something that's explored and developed later on into the series, so that's always quite, just seeing the early phases of that is quite interesting. So it makes for an enjoyable enough story, certainly not one of the most memorable Doctor Who stories there's ever been, but again, not that bad. Next at number 9 is Voyage of the Damned, the following Christmas special from back that era of Doctor Who in 2007. Of course, the big sort of selling point of that story was it was featuring Kylie Minogue. And well, it did work. I think it's still pretty much the most highest rated episode of Doctor Who there's ever been. It got like 13 or 14 million people watching it that day, which is ridiculous and crazy. And yes, is significantly down to having Kylie Minogue in it. Like, that is a massive, probably the biggest name Doctor Who's ever had. It's a bit of a bizarre idea to have a singer playing basically the main companion role for an episode of Doctor Who, but I think it works reasonably well. Like, she isn't a bad actress, I think, particularly in this episode. She does seem to do a reasonably good job of it. It's obviously quite a sort of heartfelt tale towards the end, when she sort of has to sacrifice herself, and the Doctor's kind of heartbroken about that to a degree as well, because you've kind of, obviously it's kind of teeing them up to, they could have been companions, she could have been a companion in the TARDIS and all that, but we know it's Kylie Minogue. Of course she's not going to do a whole series of Doctor Who. And obviously this feels like a bit of a disaster movie kind of thing as well, with the Titanic style thing, the Titanic sinking and whatnot, and that sort of having to kind of, battle the way through the ship to be able to find kind of the front of it and control it, and just about right at the end, the spectacular shot of them sort of lifting it over Buckingham Palace also looks quite impressive as well. And so it kind of is one of those, it's definitely too long, because I think it's about an hour and a quarter long, and it does feel too long. It is, I mean, obviously that's probably trying to push it to the disaster movie style of length, a really kind of long feature-length Doctor Who episode. and having Kylie Minogue in it, of course, you want to make the most use of that. But yes, as a story, it kind of follows many of the tropes of a disaster movie in terms of sort of lots of the main characters dying, having sort of similar kind of aspects, them having to sort of go over badly built bridges and stuff like that. Like, yes, that's all a little bit sort of not bog standard necessarily, but a little bit sort of what you're used to from a disaster movie. And again, that's the kind of Christmas specials being very much a take on a different genre to a large degree in terms of, well, if we had a superhero movie already, this is a disaster movie, focusing on different Christmas stories. Like, that seems to be what the Christmas episode is about, is often about putting a spin on something else rather than creating your own unique episode of Doctor Who. And yes, it shows again in this story, which I think is again not bad, somewhere in the middle. Also, shout out to Mr. Copper, whose name I can't remember. If you haven't ever, search up his name and search up Doctor Who magazine, and you'll read what is a fairly sad article that somehow got posted, where you can basically tell that he hates Doctor Who with a passion, and that he is clearly just a grumpy old man and nothing else, nothing more than that. As much as he looks lovely in this episode, the actual man himself clearly isn't the nicest of people. So yeah, do go look him up. I'm sorry I can't remember his name. I'll try and put his name on screen if I can remember it and find it. But do look him up and put Doctor Who magazine, and there's an interesting article if you haven't read it before. It's like 10 years old, but it is very interesting to hear his thoughts on being in Doctor Who. Now, in at number 8, it is The Husbands of River Song, the 2015 Christmas special featuring Peter Capaldi and, of course, Alex Kinston's River Song character as well. The final story for River Song in Doctor Who, having been in it for 7 years, on and off at different times and everything like that. And this is one of those stories where it kind of starts out as a kind of silly comedic episode, of course featuring Matt Lucas back when Nardole was purely a comedic character, and it's literally a one-off comedic character in this story. That's the whole point of him and nothing else. But then by the end of the story, the last 15-20 minutes, it becomes very much a more kind of sort of emotional sort of story, really, and kind of having those scenes between River and the Doctor at the end of the episode to kind of feel really sad, and then obviously the twist that actually you've got 24 more years together is like such a brilliant kind of twist to spin it right at the very, very end of the story. But I just feel like those scenes towards the end of the story really raise it up above some of the other ones. Otherwise, if it had just continued with this comedic element throughout the episode, it probably wouldn't be ranked quite so high, because as good as it is as comedy, like the scene with the Doctor having to going in the TARDIS and being the companion for the first time and going, wow, it's bigger on the inside, is such a fantastic scene, and one of my favourite scenes from Doctor Who. I think it's just brilliant and shows off Peter Capaldi as such a brilliant Doctor again, in my opinion. But yes, then it just kind of almost sort of twists towards the end once they start reading River. He starts reading River's diaries, and the Doctor hears it, and the Doctor reveals himself. As soon as the Doctor reveals himself, that's, I feel like, when this episode really twists a little bit and becomes a much more, yes, sort of heartwarming, emotional, beautiful sort of story to really kind of conclude it. And of course, this episode was going to be Stephen Moffat's final story. Ideally, he would have left after this story, and then Chris Chibnall or whoever would have come in and written Series 10. It was only because Chris couldn't do it until 2018 that Stephen Art said he would stay on to write Series 10 as well, and that's why we got a gap here, because it had to be delayed so Stephen could do Sherlock and things like that. But yes, when Stephen wrote this story, it was pretty much with the thought process that this would be his last script for Doctor Who. And I think it kind of shows, because at the end of this story, it does almost feel like the end of an era, it feels like it is a very nicely wrapped up, tied in a bow, and especially putting on and they all lived happily ever after as well on the end of the story. Just feels, yeah, they're just trying to kind of create it as the end of an era, the end of a story, which ultimately, of course, it isn't. But it just, I think, feels a little bit like that, and did at the time feel a bit like that. I remember watching it and kind of thinking, there was no next time trailer, there's no hint of the series returning anytime soon, there's no news about it or press releases or anything. It kind of felt like it just sort of ended, and we really didn't know where Doctor Who was going to go next. And of course, where it went was a year's gap and delay. But no, so yes, it just kind of feels like a sort of end of an era style story, and has particularly a really strong ending, which is why it comes up at number 8. So we've reached the halfway mark. We're coming at number 7 with The Christmas Invasion, the original sort of Doctor Who Christmas special in 2005, David Tennant's first story, and what for me is probably nostalgic, I think, more than anything else, but I do still think is a really, really good story. It's a kind of classic alien invasion story on Christmas Day, where the Doctor kind of is bedbound for a lot of it as well, because he's kind of recovering from the regeneration. It's sort of different, almost to some degree a different way of doing it in terms of having the Doctor out of action rather than kind of running around a bit mental and not know what's going on. Like the Doctor's just lying in bed not doing anything. And so it's kind of, to a degree, a bold choice, because having the Doctor's first story and having basically not appear for the first 40 minutes is a little bit risky, I think. But I think looking at the story as a whole does work quite effectively, and the moment when he does come out the TARDIS, open the doors and reveal himself is just a brilliant sort of moment to see that the Doctor is back. He's here to save the day from these horrible Sycorax that the humans can't quite defeat, but the Doctor will defeat. And so yes, I think the Sycorax are an interesting villain as well, the whole kind of controlling people's blood based on their blood type and everything like that. And yeah, it just could have put them all on the edge of buildings as well, sort of suggesting they're going to commit suicide. It's quite a kind of bold thing to do on Christmas Day, I think. Put a load of humans on top of a building suggesting they're going to kill themselves. Seems, yeah, quite risky. Bold Doctor Who, but it obviously it's all the Doctor saves the day in the end, and there's definitely, as I say, an element of nostalgia for this story because it is the first Christmas special, 2005. I would have been 7 years old, and I can still vaguely remember sitting in my grandparents' living room watching this episode as it aired. And so yeah, there's always going to be a nostalgic element about some of those earlier RTD episodes. I think there's nothing you can kind of do to get away from that, and you shouldn't really get away from that. It's great. But I feel like this is probably one of Russell's better Christmas special scripts that he wrote. Obviously having it first time, it's one of those that again is kind of shoehorned into Christmas in terms of having metal Santas that blow fire out of their trumpets. Like, that's shoehorning Christmas, and the Killer Christmas Tree is again shoehorning Christmas into this episode. But I don't think it's to the detriment of the story particularly that they've shoehorned Christmas in where some episodes it is. So yes, overall this is a very enjoyable story. Obviously sets up a new era as well with David Tennant and Billie Piper going off to travel the world, or travel the universe even, and that sort of nice moment at the end where they sort of realise where they're going to head off to the stars is quite fantastic. So yes, overall it is a thoroughly enjoyable Christmas special. Now, sorry, Matt Smith fans, to disappoint you by only putting this at number 6, but at number 6 it is The Time of the Doctor, the final episode of Matt Smith's 11th Doctor, of course his regeneration story, set on Trenzalore. We finally go back there again, the town of Christmas and everything like that. It's kind of it's a proper Stephen Moffat Christmas special really, isn't it? It's a bit wacky, finding funny ways to involve Christmas in a story in terms of having the planet or this town called Christmas. It's a bit crazy, of course, snow and turkey and whatever, Christmas dinner and things like that as well. Being Matt's last story, you have a lovely, beautiful regeneration scene. I think that's what brings the episode up even more for me, is the regeneration scene. Because as an overall regeneration story, I don't think it is one of the best ones. It feels a little bit too crammed into an hour in terms of what they're trying to do with this story. The kind of battle and trying to protect Trenzalore for 300 years shouldn't have been shown in all of 2-minute montage. It should have been a lot longer than that and really should have been kind of interesting. But there's still a lot of kind of emotive farewells between the Doctor and Clara, maybe one too many at times, but it does feel, yes, like a very proper emotional sort of regeneration story that obviously just to a degree happened to be on Christmas Day, therefore you have to bring in Christmassy elements to the story. I think it does work in that regard, and yes, it is an episode that I can enjoy, watch back again. Of course, yes, as I say, it has the wonderful ending. I think Matt's regeneration scene is one of my absolute favourite sort of regenerations. The speech and everything, the music, it's just perfectly crafted to sort of end the story with, and him kind of up on top of that building, sort of shooting Dalek spaceships with regeneration energy. It's kind of to a degree all that's good or bad with Doctor Who at that time, depending on your opinion. But it still makes for a spectacular ending for Matt Smith's Doctor, of course, and seeing him regenerate end as well. So I think, yeah, overall it kind of does shoehorn a lot of different things. Of course, you have so many monsters that turn up in this episode as well. It does feel like throwing the kitchen sink at a story to try and get as much into it, trying to also wrap up the whole stuff with the cracks, getting the Doctor's regeneration limit moved as well. There's a lot going on, and you really feel like it could have done with the second part, like The End of Time got, or something like that. But unfortunately it wasn't the way, and it comes in at number 6 on my list. Now, number 5, probably the first of the surprising choices in, I think, a collection of surprising choices to come where I'm going to get absolutely hammered. But at number 5 is The Snowmen, the 2012 Christmas special featuring the sort of one-off but not one-off appearance of Clara Oswald, played by Jenna Coleman. And I really love this story. I think it's got a real kind of fairy tale element to it to a degree, in terms of Clara discovering this sort of magic cloud in the sky with this magic box as well. And that I've always, since I saw this episode for the first time, loved those scenes where she kind of discovers this invisible staircase and goes up it and goes around and walks around the TARDIS up on this cloud. It's just kind of, with the music as well that they use there, it's just such a wonderful, sort of beautiful fairy tale kind of scene for a Doctor Who episode, which I just think is so brilliant. And I to a large degree, I wish that we had Clara Oswald rather than Clara Oswald as the main companion. The Victorian Clara, I would have liked to have seen her kind of extend into as the main companion. It was originally the plans, I believe, to have her as the main companion, but of course that wasn't the case with this story. And it also kind of makes it a bit mind-boggling, but also beautiful and emotional and brilliant to have her die in this episode as well, again, for the second time. And we're like, what? How on earth? This doesn't make any sense. It's a bit crazy. And so yes, so then with this episode, of course, yes, we have that beautiful sort of the Doctor kind of having to say goodbye to, very emotional moment, having to say goodbye to Clara, of course, because he was going to travel with her, and she sort of thought she was going to be able to travel with the Doctor. The Doctor's introduced her into the TARDIS and everything, and it's like, he seems so happy again after being completely shut off by losing the Ponds, and it's just kind of heartbreaking in that regard, and really sets him on his mission for the second half of Series 7 to go and find out who Clara really is and try and just understand all that mystery. So I think that the whole sort of Clara aspect of this story is really, really good and really pushes it up for me. Of course, you've got the great intelligence in there as well, which I think is fantastic. Having Richard E. Grant in there playing a character as well, I think is playing the great intelligence essentially is brilliant. Bringing back a sort of alien intelligence from the 1960s is just a classic Doctor Who thing to do, really, and I think is very, very effective in this story as well. And just sort of creates what I find is a very kind of exciting Christmas special with lots of great sort of elements thrown into it. Having Vastra back as well, Jenny and Vastra, I think as well, were kind of a good sort of extra companions to introduce into this story almost, and of Strax as well, of course. How can I forget Strax? Having it set in the Victorian times as well is quite nice for this story as well, and it just sort of feels like it's set at Christmas. There's lots of snow around, but it's not really talking about the fact it's a Christmas special. Doesn't feel shoehorned in quite the same way, I find. It's just kind of, it's snow in the background, but we're not going to focus on that. I think that's really, really good. That's sort of important to kind of avoid that element of it, I think, at times. And so yes, it's good to see that, and that overall makes it a really enjoyable story for me, and why it comes in at number 5 on the list. Now, number 4, this will probably be a good old controversial choice. It is The End of Time, David Tennant's final story as the Doctor, which I have always, since I saw it for the first time, been a sucker for, particularly part 2. I know it's not taking on Christmas Day, but the story as a whole still, I just love it. It's just like Russell throwing everything and the kitchen sink and more at this episode, chucking every single element he can possibly find, making it as big, epic, ridiculous, crazy as he possibly can, off the scales. And I just really enjoy it. I can't help it, guys. I'm sorry, but I do. Like, the Master, of course, is mental in this story, but his idea of wanting to make the whole world him is classic, crazy, bonkers Master style, and is a brilliant cliffhanger to leave it on, I should also point out. Bringing back the Time Lords, what a great idea there as well. After building it up for 5 years, then we bring them back. That's brilliant. Having Timothy Dalton playing Rassilon, that's such a great idea. He's such a great performance in this story as well. Of course, it's David Tennant's last story, so we have his sort of last stand. I know a lot of people are kind of divisive about the whole him getting emotional about regenerating, and I think I just look at that as that particular incarnation of the Doctor is a little bit vain, maybe, and a little bit kind of feels that emotion, and that's not the opinion of every single incarnation of the Doctor. That's the opinion of this incarnation of the Doctor, that he doesn't want to die and that it feels like dying when he does have to regenerate. So yes, there's some very emotional scenes both in episode 1 and in episode 2 of this story, and those scenes, so Wilf is fantastic. I love Bernard Cribbins, and Wilf is just such a great companion. And of course the Fornox thing is just so heartbreaking at the end of this story as well, when we think it's all going to be saved, the Doctor saved the day, and then no, he hasn't, and he has to sacrifice himself. And I have always been a sucker for those last few scenes. I know it's very sort of self-indulgent to go around and see all the companions again one last time, and it's one of those that's divisive. Some people will love it, some people will hate it, and that's absolutely fair enough. But for me, I've always loved those scenes. The music, the Vale music is beautiful, and then of course David's regeneration scene is just sort of so emotional. Even though I'm not a massive fan of David Tennant's Doctor, he's not one of my favourite Doctors, he'd be 3rd or 4th of the New Who Doctors, still as a story I love this one, and his emotional goodbye and everything, it just clicks with me and really, really works, and so that's why it comes in at number 4. Right, number 3, hopefully should be slightly of a less controversial choice, shall we say. It's A Christmas Carol, the first Matt Smith Christmas special from 2010. Stephen Moffat's also first attempt at a Doctor Who Christmas special. Of course, this is one of those proper doing a sort of Christmas story for a Doctor Who Christmas special, and I think A Christmas Carol just makes so much sense to do for a Doctor Who story in terms of the sort of focusing on different periods of time, going into the past and going to the future. Like, it's just, it's almost like it's written for Doctor Who, I think, to a degree. And I think Stephen writes a very, very good kind of version of that fits nicely with Doctor Who. There's a lot of emotion on Christmas Day actually with a lot of these episodes. They always have quite sort of an emotional attachment and everything with it on Christmas Day. Of course, with Abigail, the character, having sort of dying on Christmas Day and everything like that, her sort of living at her last hours before she's going to die. And Kazran, we sort of meeting him as an old man and a young man, and kind of finding out why he's turned into a grumpy, mean old man, I think is brilliantly explored, and being able to use the kind of time travel elements that Stephen's almost sort of prided for, working effectively in this story as well, I think is really, really clever. And yes, it just overall creates such a fantastic story. I think it really kind of keeps you interested and engaged the whole time. Very tied to Christmas, but not in a shoehorned way, just by telling a proper Christmas story in a Doctor Who way. Matt, I think, is fantastic in this story as well. And it just all comes around to create a great story. And getting Michael Gambon, I think, to play Kazran was fantastic as well. He really puts in a great performance, this proper Scrooge-like figure that sort of seems so mean and horrible, but then obviously the kind of finding out at the end and working out why and meaning that he's able to be a bit more happy at the end of this story, should we say. Of course, there's another one that doesn't have much of Amy and Rory, and it's kind of interesting that Amy and Rory basically were never really involved in either of the Christmas specials they had. They were kind of pushed to the sidelines of the whole of both of them. I don't really know quite why it happened like that, but that was the case. And it's the case here again, but I feel like, unlike The Doctor, the Widow and the Wardrobe, this episode isn't dragged down by not having them in this. It's just a fantastic story as it is, and that's why it's at number 3. And so here we go, only 2 more stories left to go. If you've been keeping track of this, you'll probably know what these last 2 stories are going to be, but what's the order going to be? Number 2 is Last Christmas, the 2014 Christmas special featuring Peter Capaldi as the Doctor at the end of Series 8 with Clara as well, and Danny Pink turning up for a little bit of the episode as well. Now this episode, since I watched it, I brilliantly enjoyed it. It feels less like a normal Christmas special, I think, in terms of it's more scary, it's more dark, it's more serious. It fits more with the style of Series 8 to a lot of the other Christmas specials that we've had, where there's always a kind of, it's got to be a bit lighter and funnier because it's Christmas Day. It feels like in this particular story we're kind of not focusing on that, and it is just a very, very interesting base under siege story with a bit of Inception, a bit of Alien in it thrown into it as well, to create just a fascinating, enjoyable story that's really kind of intriguing as you're trying to work out whether they're still in a dream or not, whether they're in a dream within a dream within a dream. These dream crabs are a great idea. You've got Santa in there as well, which is a sort of only Doctor Who would do that, and I think it's also portrayed really, really well. Nick Frost playing Santa Claus, I think he does a really, really good job of playing the character. Of course, dealing with the fallout of the Series 8 finale as well, with Clara and Danny and everything like that, and kind of, this almost feels like the epilogue to Series 8, the kind of wrap-up of a conclusion that you needed, and I think is done very, very effectively in this story. And of course, for me personally, when we find out at the end of the story that actually it's still a dream and that it's not old Clara and that Clara is able to stay with us, was for me a fantastic moment. I say some fans were like, oh, we got Clara for another year. I was like, yes, we've got Clara for another year, because I love Clara as a companion. I always have. And it was just such a brilliant kind of twist, because the rumours had all been that Clara was going to be leaving, or Jenny Coleman was going to be leaving after this episode, and she turns up as an old woman, and we're like, that's it, like they've escaped the dream, she's an old woman, surely this is it, the emotional goodbye, having the crackers, them pulling the crackers where they did the opposite in the previous Christmas special as well, and then just to have that twist of Santa turn up, it's such a kind of euphoric moment, I think, if you're a fan of the 12th Doctor and Clara. To be able to have them sort of realise it's actually a dream and to go on another year's sort of series of adventures is, yes, a great moment to end this story on. And it just kind of has it feels less, as I've said, like a Christmas special to some degree, I think. It's set on a kind of rather creepy, dark base, and yes, does just fit the Series 8 vibe. But for me, I've always liked the Capaldi era Series 8, that sort of vibe for the show, the slightly darker vibe, and that's why I love this story. And so guys, it is time for number 1. Get the pitchforks out if you haven't already. I'm sure you'll have guessed what number 1 is, and I'm sure you're all going to kill me in the comment section, but number 1 is Twice Upon a Time. So yes, it is the probably final Doctor Who Christmas special, last year's Christmas special from 2017, the regeneration story for Peter Capaldi, featuring the first Doctor as well, played by David Bradley. And for me, yes, I am a massive Peter Capaldi fan, so definitely there's an element of bias towards it, but I feel like that's natural. Some people would put Time with the Doctor at the top if they love Matt Smith. Like, that's just how it works, and that's why I put Twice Upon a Time at the top. And because I think it's, yes, there's not necessarily a huge amount of plot in this story. It's very much more about the characters sort of bringing Bill back for one final sort of story, having the Doctors meet, having Peter Capaldi sort of dealing with having to accept the regeneration and going around that, I think is kind of interestingly explored in this story. Of course, yes, bringing back the First Doctor is a fascinating idea. I know people's problems with this story about the whole First Doctor being too sexist. Yes, I agree with you, he is too sexist in this story and unrealistic compared to the actual character, but I feel like apart from that, it's a brilliant, brilliant story. And I do still think that it's pretty remarkable that in 2017, BBC One Christmas Day prime time, we've got actual footage from the 10th planet in it. Black and white, terribly quality footage from 1966 is in a 2017 episode of Doctor Who on Christmas Day. I still think that's kind of quite remarkable and just like crazy. And like Stephen was just like, I don't care anymore, he's leaving, I'm leaving, I'm just going to do whatever. And he chucked the First Doctor and a load of footage from 10th Planet in. It's just brilliant. And then redoing the First Doctor's regeneration as well. I feel like this adds to the regeneration of the First Doctor rather than take away from it or anything like that. And the actual regeneration moment is, of course, use the same footage rather than trying to reshoot it, which I think is important and really well done in this story. And yes, it's just one of those. It's sort of one of those stories that I've always really enjoyed. It feels like a great conclusion to the 12th Doctor. It sort of helps him to be able to accept that actually he does need to regenerate, focusing on the World War I battlefield as well, and that moment when they all get up out of the trenches and that sort of Christmas Day armistice, tying it to Christmas there as well, and turning it into sort of such a beautiful moment, a kind of the human miracle I think it's described as in the episode, and it really is just a brilliant scene. Yes, there's another Lethbridge Stewart, which is slightly shoehorned in, though I think Mark Gatiss' character is good and entertaining, if yes, a little bit shoehorned into this story. Having Bill back as well I think is quite nice, even if it's sort of not her. But the idea of testimony is quite a good idea in this whole sort of people who are dead can come back, sort of having their testimony, their sort of personality and soul put into a kind of fake body, almost to kind of be able to kind of meet their sort of loved ones after they've died and things like that. It's quite a nice idea to explore, even if a little bit dark almost for Christmas Day, I think you could say. But I feel like there's enough other stuff going on in this story to kind of cover up for that. And I do still love those final few minutes when we say goodbye to the First Doctor, have his regeneration, sort of again, seeing that again happening. Then the Doctor saying goodbye to the companions, including a certain returning companion for one final scene. And his regeneration scene, I still absolutely love. His speech is wonderful, and it just kind of creates, I think, a fantastic conclusion to the 12th Doctor in Doctor Who. So yes, there we go. I love Twice Upon a Time. It is my number one. I'm sure it'll be nobody else's number one, but it's mine. This is my channel, so that's what I'm going with. But do let me know down in the comments below, guys, how badly do you disagree with me and think that every single episode I've chosen is wrong in the order I put? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say down in the comments below. Give me your ranking, if it's a top 5, top 10, or rank all 13. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say down in the comments below about the Christmas specials. But yes, other than that, guys, I do hope you have a lovely Christmas day tomorrow. Have a nice, relaxed, fun day. Hope you get lots of Doctor Who gifts. Hopefully I will as well. And I'll be back again next week in time for the New Year's Day special resolution. I've got several videos coming up next week, sort of in the run-up to that. I'll be previewing it, reviewing it, doing the soundtrack, of course. And so, yeah, although Christmas is tomorrow, there's no Christmas Day special, but we've still got a big episode of Doctor Who to look forward to, and hopefully with some Daleks. But that's it from this video, guys, so Merry Christmas, do remember to hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you again next week for the video. Goodbye!